The passing of the coercive acts or intolerable acts really damaged Boston, and eventually the other colonies began to send Boston food and other types of supplies because of the harshness of those intolerable acts. And soon in September of 1774, representatives were sent to Philadelphia in order to meet in the First Continental Congress to decide what they were going to do about these coercive acts. The only colony that did not send representatives to the First Continental Congress was Georgia. Now, the initial meeting was to figure out how they could make King George III understand what was happening in the colonies and for him to correct those grievances or those wrongdoings that the colonists felt was going on. Their intention was not to separate just yet. So they put together the Declaration of Rights that they sent to King George, and in those Declaration of Rights, they talked about the idea of life, liberty, and property, straight from John Locke, and how the colonists here in the Americas had these liberties and had these rights, and they were being infringed upon because of these coercive acts. Now, with this First Continental Congress, they also decided that they were going to hope for the best, but they needed to prepare for the worst. So they pretty much said that from here on out, these coercive or intolerable acts were now null and void. They did not accept them as correct laws, and they also began to prepare their colonial militias for the idea of war. And the boycotts began to increase throughout the colonies. King George III, in his reaction to the Declaration of Rights, was that he actually sent more troops into Boston to try and keep control of the city. Colonists began to collect supplies and collect weapons and to store them in secret because they weren't allowed to have them. And eventually, the governor, Thomas Gage, who was appointed by the king, so this was the new governor as part of the coercive acts of Massachusetts, sent troops to try and seize these weapons that he had learned were being kept in secret at the city of Concord. Now, one of the spies from the Sons of Liberty found out about the fact that Thomas Gage knew what was going on and was going to send men to recover these weapons and seize these supplies, that he went ahead and warned Paul Revere, who was also one of these Sons of Liberty, of what was happening. And Paul Revere then was going to send word to the colonists back in Lexington and Concord to beware of the British that were coming to try and seize their supplies. So this is where Paul Revere's midnight ride comes in, right? They came up with a plan that they were going to have one of their spies up at the Old North Church up in the tower. This was Robert Newman, who was going to keep watch. And when he saw the British coming, he was going to alert Paul Revere and the other riders of whether the British were coming by land or by sea. William Dawes and Paul Revere were the two who were waiting, and they rode out to warn that the British were coming, right? As they rode out of the city to try and warn the other colonists that the British were coming to seize those weapons and to prepare. So this leads us to the Battle of Lexington and Concord, right? The official start of the war, of the American Revolution. Now, these colonial militiamen were known as Minutemen because they were supposed to be able to be ready in a minute. And about 700 redcoats, or British soldiers, reached Lexington, and about 70 Minutemen were waiting for them. Now, nobody knows for sure up to this day how exactly the battle began or who shot that first gunshot that began the battle, but that has always been referred to as the shot heard around the world because that is what officially began the American Revolution. Eventually, the British were able to push back the militia in Lexington and continue forward into Concord. Once they reached Concord, they were actually surprised by more Minutemen. Eventually, these Minutemen, though, were forced to have to retreat. But by that time, about 200 redcoats or British soldiers were killed, and the British then left Concord and retreated to Boston. And so this pretty much becomes the first real battle between the British and the colonists, sparking the start of the American Revolution.